The dog was not supposed to do this. 200 people in the gymnasium watched a county K9 break away from his handler, cross the basketball court alone, and sit down at the feet of the old man with the mop. He did not sit the way a dog sits. He sat at attention, chest squared, ears up, eyes forward, the way a soldier sits beside someone he has been ordered to guard with his life. The handler called the dog twice by name. The dog did not so much as flick an ear. And the old janitor in the gray coveralls, a man most of these people had walked past every day for 19 years, without ever once learning his name, slowly set down his mop with a hand that had started to shake. The whole room went quiet. Not the polite quiet of an assembly, the deep, prickling quiet of 200 people realizing all at once that they were looking at something they did not understand. The principal stood frozen, with the microphone halfway to her mouth. A child in the front row whispered a question her mother could not answer. Nobody in that gymnasium understood what they were seeing. Nobody, that is, except the old man in the coveralls, and the dog who had refused against every command to leave his side. Before we go on, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. If this story moves you, please subscribe and stay with it until the very end. We read every single one, and what you are about to learn about the quiet old man with the mop will stay with you for a long, long time. His name was Earl Buckley, and he was 76 years old, and almost no one in Cedar Grove, Tennessee, knew the first true thing about him. He was tall once, and was still tall under the stoop, lean and spare, with a head of close-cropped white hair and a face folded deep by 76 years of weather and work. His hands were enormous and careful, and marked all over with the small white scars of a lifetime of labor, and on the inside of his right forearm, faded almost to a shadow now, was a tattoo of an eagle, globe, and anchor that he kept covered with a long sleeve in every season. His eyes were a pale, faded blue, the blue of a sky that has been looked at for a very long time, and they had a stillness in them that people sometimes mistook for simplicity, and that was in fact its exact opposite. They were the eyes of a man who had seen the worst thing a young man can see, and had carried it quietly for 55 years without ever setting it down on anyone else. He was unfailingly gentle. He learned the name of every child in that school and forgot none of them. He moved through the halls with a contained, deliberate calm, the bearing of a man who had once been responsible for whether other men lived through the night, and who had decided when that was over to ask the world for nothing at all. Most people thought he was just the janitor. Most people had never thought about him long enough to be wrong. Earl Buckley had enlisted in the United States Marine Corps in 1967 at the age of 17, with his mother's reluctant signature. And in 1968, he had been a scout dog handler with a Marine scout dog platoon in the jungles south of Da Nang. His dog was a German shepherd named Duke, and the two of them had walked point out ahead of the patrol, alone where the dog's nose was the only thing standing between 50 men and a wire in the dark. On a morning in the spring of 1969, Duke had stopped dead on a trail and refused to take another step, hackles up, staring at a tree line that looked empty, and Earl had trusted him and signaled the column down, and the ambush that opened up 3 seconds later went over their heads instead of through them. 41 men walked out of that valley because a dog wouldn't move, and a 19-year-old believed him. When the firefight was over, Earl had carried 2 wounded Marines to the landing zone himself, one at a time under fire, and the citation that followed used words like conspicuous gallantry that he had never been able to read all the way through. What the citation did not fix was the thing that broke him. When his tour ended, the Marine Corps classified the war dogs as surplus equipment. Earl was not permitted to bring Duke home. He never saw the dog again, and for 55 years he had carried that, the face of the dog who saved 50 men, left behind in a country they were abandoning, and he had never once spoken of any of it to a living soul. He came home, and he went quiet, and eventually he picked up a mop, because a mop asked nothing of him and gave him somewhere to put his hands. The dog in the gymnasium was named Sarge, a 4-year-old German shepherd 90 pounds of dark sable and disciplined muscle, with a coat that ran black along the spine and burned to amber at the chest, and a single white scar above his left eye from a training accident. He belonged to the Cedar Grove County Sheriff's Office, and his handler was Deputy Aaron Wells, 34 years old, himself a Marine before he was a deputy, a square-jawed and serious young man who had brought Sarge to the school that morning to do a Veterans Day demonstration for the kids. Sarge was a working dog through and through. He moved with an economy that took years to build, never reacting to noise, only ever to meaning. In 2 years of demonstrations, he had never once broken from Wells for any reason. He was, Wells would say later, the most disciplined animal he had ever worked. Which was exactly why, when Sarge stood up in the middle of a search drill, turned his head toward the back of the gym as if someone had called him in a language only he could hear, and walked away across the court without a backward glance, Deputy Aaron Wells felt the hair stand up on his arms. The gymnasium was packed that morning because it was the 11th of November. Veterans Day, and Cedar Grove was the kind of small Tennessee town that still filled a room for it. The bleachers were full of families, and the cold morning light came in gray through the high windows, and the air smelled of floor wax and coffee and damp coats, the particular smell of a school that has never quite warmed up. On the stage stood a row of folding chairs for the town's honored veterans, a World War II man of 98 in a wheelchair, 2 from Korea, a handful from Vietnam and the Gulf, and a banner that read, "Thank you for your service," in a child's painted letters. Earl Buckley was not on that stage. Earl Buckley was at the back of the gym with his mop and his bucket, where he had been told to be. He had been told to be there by Brandon Keller. Keller was 41, the school district's new director of operations and facilities, a sharp-dressed and ambitious man whose uncle sat on the school board and who had arrived 18 months earlier with a mandate to cut costs and a complete absence of interest in the people he was cutting. He had already forced out 2 longtime employees and replaced them with a contract service owned, as it happened, by a college friend. Earl Buckley was next on his list, an old man drawing a full salary and good benefits for work a contractor would do for half. And Keller had spent 3 months building a paper file of petty write-ups to justify it. He found the old janitor's slowness and his silence faintly contemptible. That very morning he had stopped Earl in the hallway in front of 2 teachers and told him, with a tight smile, to stay out of sight during the assembly and keep the halls presentable, because today's about the real veterans, Earl, not the cleanup crew. He had said it the way a man says a thing he is certain carries no cost. "I run this building," Keller liked to say. Sentiment doesn't balance a budget. He believed he was untouchable. His uncle was on the board. For 18 months, he had been right. So Earl had taken his mop to the back of his own gymnasium on Veterans Day and stood quietly against the wall while the town honored the service of men he had bled beside, in spirit if not in person, and he had said nothing because saying nothing was the thing he was best at in all the world. He had folded a stray program someone dropped and set it neatly on the bleacher. He had watched the old man from World War II be wheeled to the front, and he had felt the old grief rise the way it always rose this time of year. He had heard a dog bark once, somewhere out in the parking lot when the deputy first arrived that morning, and the sound had gone through him like cold water. He had heard a bark exactly like that one other time in his life, 55 years ago, on the morning they loaded the last of the platoon's dogs onto a truck that was not going to the airfield, and Duke had stood in the back of it and barked at him, once, the way you call a man who is walking away. And Earl had not been allowed to turn around. He pushed the memory down now, the way he always did. He was a man who had been overlooked so thoroughly for so long that he had stopped expecting anything else. He carried it with a dignity that no one in that room had earned the right to see. And then a dog he had never met stood up across the gymnasium and looked straight at him. In the 3rd row of the bleachers, a 4th-grade teacher named Carol Hennessy had been half watching the demonstration and half watching the old janitor at the back wall, the way she sometimes did, because she was one of the few people in that building who said good morning to Earl and meant it. She had always wondered about him, the careful way he carried himself, the long sleeves in July, the fact that he flinched just slightly at loud, sudden sounds. She would tell people afterward that she was looking right at him when the dog turned, and that the strangest part was not the dog at all. The strangest part was Earl's face. For one unguarded second, before the room noticed anything, the old man had looked at that shepherd across the gym the way a person looks at someone they buried a long time ago and never expected to see again. Deputy Wells had been running Sarge through a simple article search drill, hiding a scent dummy under a chair for the kids, when the dog quit. One moment Sarge was working the scent. The next he was still, head up, locked onto the far wall. Wells gave the recall. Nothing. He gave it again, sharper, and 200 people watched a County K-9 ignore a direct command for the first time in his career and walk the length of the basketball court to the old man in coveralls and fold himself into a flawless attention sit at his feet. Wells crossed the floor after him, embarrassed and baffled, and crouched down. "I am so sorry, sir, he's never—" "Sarge, heel." And the dog did not move, and Earl Buckley looked down at the shepherd at his feet with his pale eyes filling, and he said, very softly, almost to himself, "Easy, son." And his right hand, without his telling it to, made a small, low motion at his side that he had not made in 55 years. Sarge dropped instantly into a down, nose between his paws, eyes never leaving the old man. Wells went very still. He knew that signal. There was no civilian on earth who made that signal by accident. "Sir," he said quietly, "where did you learn to do that?" And Earl didn't answer, and the silence stretched. And that was when Brandon Keller came marching across the gym, with his face flushed, because the program was off the rails, and the old man he was about to fire was somehow at the center of it. "All right, that's enough. Earl, I told you to stay out of the way. Officer, I apologize. This man is just our custodian. He shouldn't even be." He reached out to take Earl by the arm and steer him toward the doors, and Sarge came up off the floor between them with a single low sound in his chest, hackles like a ridge, and put his body squarely between the old man and Brandon Keller, and would not be moved. Keller stumbled back. The room made a noise, a collective intake of breath, and into it Deputy Wells stood up and held out a hand to stop everyone and said, Don't touch him. That dog knows something we don't." It was the cruelest possible moment for Earl, and it nearly broke him. 200 faces turned to stare. Keller, humiliated and furious, recovered enough to address the room with a strained laugh. "Folks, I'm sorry. Let's please get back to honoring our actual veterans." And the word actual landed on Earl Buckley like a hand across the face. 55 years of swallowed grief and silent service dismissed in a single adjective in front of his whole town. The old man's chin dropped. He bent, slowly, to pick up his mop, ready to do what he had always done, which was to disappear, and the dog would not let him. Sarge took the hem of Earl's coverall sleeve gently in his mouth and held it, and looked up at him, and would not release it. And Earl Buckley stood there, trapped between the door and a dog who refused to agree that he was nobody. Deputy Wells made his decision in that moment. He was not going to let this pass. What Sarge did next silenced the room a second time, and for good. The dog let go of the sleeve, backed up 2 steps, and sat in front of Earl at rigid attention. And then, slowly, deliberately, he lifted one paw off the floor and held it up, the formal salute and present that a trained dog offers only to a handler, and he held it there, trembling slightly with the effort, in front of 200 silent people. He had done for the old janitor, unbidden, the thing Aaron Wells had spent 2 years teaching him to do only on command. There was no longer any question in that room about what they were looking at. There was only the question of who. Deputy Wells turned to face the bleachers. and he did not raise his voice, and every soul in that gym heard him. "This man," he said, "is a United States Marine. That's an eagle, globe, and anchor on his arm. And that signal he just gave my dog without thinking about it. There is exactly one kind of person in the world who carries that in his hands. He's a war dog handler." He looked at Earl. "Sir, will you tell them, or should I find out?" And the old man's eyes spilled over at last, and in a voice that hadn't told this story in half a century, he said 2 words: "Duke." His name was Duke. It was the principal who found the rest of it, because she had pulled Earl's personnel file on her phone and gone pale at what was attached to it. A Navy Cross citation that had sat in a folder in her own office for 19 years, unread. She read it aloud into the microphone with a shaking voice. "Lance Corporal Earl Buckley, Scout Dog Handler, a morning in 1969. A dog who would not move. 41 men who came home because of it. Conspicuous gallantry. 2 wounded Marines carried out under fire. The gymnasium did not breathe." "You wrote him up for being slow," Wells said quietly, turning to Brandon Keller. "And it was not a shout, which made it worse. You told him to hide behind a mop on Veterans Day. You were 3 weeks from firing a man with the Navy Cross to give the contract to your buddy. Because the rest came out too. In the days after, the manufactured write-ups, the steered contract, the 2 employees before Earl. Keller's uncle resigned from the board within the week. Keller himself was placed on leave and, when the district's books were opened, charged with fraud. He stood in that gymnasium with 200 people looking at him the way a town looks at a man when it finally sees him clearly, and he had nothing to say. Earl Buckley, for his part, did not look at Keller at all. He had knelt down on the gym floor in his gray coveralls and put both arms around a dog named Sarge and pressed his face into the fur, and was somewhere far away, on a jungle trail, finally saying a goodbye 55 years overdue. By the following spring, the gymnasium of Cedar Grove had a new name. They held the dedication in May, with the whole town in the bleachers, and they called it the Buckley Duke Court, and beside the door they hung a plaque with the citation engraved in full, and a photograph, found by a Vietnam veterans group Deputy Wells had contacted, of a grinning 19-year-old and a black and tan shepherd in a far green country. Earl was given the recognition the Marine Corps had owed him for half a century, and he sat on the stage this time, in the front row where the real veterans sit, because that is what he had always been. Brandon Keller pleaded guilty to fraud and lost his job, his pension, and 18 months to a state facility. The 2 employees he'd forced out were offered their jobs back. Deputy Aaron Wells and Earl became something like family, the young handler and the old one, and they understood each other in the way only 2 people who have walked point with a dog can. And on the day they dedicated the court, Wells brought Earl a present that the old man could not, at first, accept: a German Shepherd puppy, 8 weeks old, from the litter of a retired military working dog, because the law had changed in the years since Earl's war, and dogs came home now. Earl held the puppy against his chest with both of his big scarred hands, and the puppy fell asleep there, and Earl Buckley, who had not let himself cry in front of anyone in 55 years, finally did, and the whole town let him, and called the puppy Duke. Sometimes the greatest among us are the ones we have trained ourselves not to see. They are not on the stage. They are at the back of the room with a mop, holding a door, sweeping a floor, carrying a thing too heavy for words, and asking the rest of us for nothing. The world is quick to measure a man by his title and his salary and the press of his clothes, and slow, so terribly slow, to look in his eyes and wonder what he has survived. But loyalty has a better eye than we do. A dog crossed a gymnasium and saw in 3 seconds what an entire town had failed to see in 19 years. Because love and loyalty read a soul the way the rest of us read a uniform. God does not always announce his heroes with trumpets. Sometimes he hides them among us in gray coveralls to see whether we will have the grace to notice, and he sends now and then a faithful creature, to point and say, "Look closer. This one mattered all along." If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to be reminded to look twice at the quiet ones, the overlooked ones, the people we pass every day without learning their names. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. And tell us this: is there someone in your own life whose true story you never thought to ask for? Your story may be exactly the light someone else needs tonight. And if you believe in honoring the humble, the faithful, and the heroes who never asked to be seen, please subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next one. May God bless you, protect your family, open your eyes to the quiet greatness around you, and remind you always, every soul you pass is carrying a story worthy of your respect.